Okay. Well, Dr. Craig, I'd like to start out by asking, you're suggesting that the actual infinite universe would be an impossibility. And I believe you've brought up Hilbert's Hotel as an example there. Could you run us through Hilbert's Hotel?
Sure. I didn't bring that up tonight, but I'd be happy to. I do in my work. David Hilbert, whom I quoted in the first speech, wanted to illustrate what it would be like if an actually infinite number of things could exist. And so he said, let's imagine a hotel with an infinite number of rooms. And let's suppose that every room is occupied. This is absolutely critical to understand. There is no vacancy in the hotel. There's a person in every room. Now he says, let's suppose somebody shows up at the desk asking for a room. The proprietor says, no problem. And he moves the person in room 1 into room 2, the person in room 2 into room 3, the person in room 3 into room 4 on out to infinity. And as a result, the first room becomes vacant and the new guest easily checks in. But before he arrived, all the rooms were full. Suppose an infinite number of new guests show up at the hotel, and again, every room is already occupied. No problem, says the proprietor. And he shifts the guest in room 1 into room 2, the guest in room 2 into room 4, the guest in room 3 into room 6. He puts every guest in the room number double his own. Well, since any number times 2 is always an even number, all of the even-numbered rooms become occupied, all of the odd-numbered rooms are vacant, and the infinity of new guests check in, even though there was no vacancy in the hotel. Well, I agree with Hilbert. Such a hotel is absurd. This is a mathematical thought experiment that could not possibly be instantiated in reality. And so this would just be one of the illustrations that one might use to show the impossibility of the existence of an actually infinite number of things.
Okay. So the issue is the question of how we can understand obvious operations that should arrive us with a bigger sum than the one that we previously had.
Well, I wouldn't put it so abstractly. I would want to say, how can you have a hotel that is absolutely fully occupied and yet can accommodate infinite numbers of new people just by moving people around? That to me strikes me as absurd.
Well, I guess I'd want to suggest that there's two different senses to bigger than that seem to be working in there. One is the numerical sense in which one set simply has a number of members greater than another. And another sense of bigger than in which any proper part of a whole, the whole is always bigger than the proper part. Now I think these two different...
Did you say is bigger or is the same as the proper part?
It's bigger, sorry.
Okay.
The whole's bigger than the proper part.
Uh-huh. Though with infinites, that fails.
Exactly.
The proper part has the same number of members as the whole.
Yeah, and that's why it's typically held that the numerical sense of bigger than would be the only one that really applies to the notion of infinity.
Yeah.
Now, does
right, and that gets you hotels like Hilbert's Hotel, which to me seems crazy.
Does this prove any more than there's some odd implications of talking about infinity?
Well, I think that is a good response. You could just say that just shows the infinite is bizarre. But I think that there comes a point at which one's credulity is stretched to the breaking point, and one says, this is mad. And I think that especially comes when you begin to subtract. And that was why I mentioned in my opening speech, subtracting infinity from infinity. Just very quickly, suppose all the odd-numbered guests check out of the hotel. In that case, an infinite number of people has left the hotel, and yet an infinite number still remain, all the even-numbered guests. So infinity minus infinity is infinity. But now suppose instead all the guests in the rooms greater than 3 check out. In this case, there are only 3 people left in the hotel. So infinity minus infinity is 3. And yet in both cases, the same number of people checked out from the same number of people. You have identical quantities minus identical quantities, and you get self-contradictory answers. In fact, you can get any answer from 0 to infinity. And I think, again, what this shows is that these are mere mathematical tricks that cannot be descriptive of the real world because self-contradictions don't come true.
Okay. I'd sort of also like to go back to the topic of quantum physics, the origin of the Big Bang, and all that sort of stuff. Hey, look, you know, you obviously know much more about the subject than I do, but I'm still puzzled. Why do people like Quentin Smith say that other people disagree with you.
Well, now, Quentin is a dear friend of mine. He's at the University of Western Michigan. We co-wrote a book called Theism, Atheism, and Big Bang Cosmology. And Quentin is an ardent atheist. He will do anything to avoid the existence of God. And he himself admits in his writing, like the book I mentioned, that the universe did begin to exist. He agrees with me that the universe began to exist. But in our book, he says, if I can quote him accurately, the most reasonable position is that the universe came from nothing, by nothing, and for nothing. Now, to me, that is the height of irrationality. But he doesn't disagree with me on the second premise, that the universe began to exist. And the people you mentioned, Guth, Steinhardt, and so forth, have already explained that this theorem that was developed in 2003 applies to their models.
Okay.
So you're right, I'm not a cosmologist, but I did do my doctoral work in the cosmological argument, which took me into cosmology as an avocation, and I try to confer with people like Vilenkin and Donald Page at the University of Alberta and so forth to keep abreast of developments in the field.
Okay. One last question, because I think I'm pretty much out of time here. If an objective morality exists, where are you finding it? I mean, where do you find the list of moral commandments?
That is an epistemological question, not an ontological question. What I mean by that, for those who aren't familiar with the terms, that's a question about how we come to know our moral principles. How do we come to a knowledge of moral principles? My concern is the question of the foundations of morality. What is their ontological foundation? Now, I'm quite open to any epistemological approaches to our knowledge of moral values that you might want to suggest. Intuition, natural law, ethics, divine revelation. I'm open to all sorts of epistemological paths to our knowledge of the good. But my interest here is not with moral epistemology, but with moral ontology. What's the foundation for moral values? So any epistemological approach to morality that you'd like to propose, I can second that. I can be quite enthusiastic about it.